Okay, let's get into this. Picture this. Two neighbors, France and Italy, arguing over a tiny patch of land, like smaller than half a square kilometer, way up in the Alps.
Right.
But here's the kicker. It involves Mont Blanc, the Mont Blanc. It almost sounds a bit, well, unbelievable, doesn't it?
It does.
What could possibly cause such a long-running fight between two major European countries over such a small, even a spectacular spot?
It's fascinating, and it's about much more than just snow and rock. This deep dive is all about that Franco-Italian Mont Blanc border dispute. We're looking at two really key sources today.
Okay.
First, an excerpt from boundary treaties and their interpretation, which gives us the legal background. And second, a policy report called Franco-Italian Mont Blanc Dispute and Climate Change, Policy Perspectives After the Quirinal Treaty.
Ah, so that one gets right into the specifics.
Exactly. It looks at the geography, the politics, and crucially, how climate change is really stirring things up now.
Right. So our mission really is to unpack this high-altitude headache. We want to understand, where did this start? How are melting glaciers and shifting terrain, these mobile borders people talk about, making it worse?
And what can actually be done? Are there solutions? How are other countries like Italy and Switzerland or Italy and Austria handling similar border shifts?
Yeah, looking at those comparisons seems key.
Absolutely. When you connect the dots, you see this clash of old treaties, the hard reality of the landscape, and these very modern climate challenges.
All focused on one mountain.
The legal text gives us the treaty basics. The policy report brings in Mont Blanc specifically, plus the environmental angle. It's quite a mix.
So let's rewind. Where did this border way up there actually come from in the first place? How did it get drawn?
Okay, so the story really begins with the 1860 Treaty of Turin. This was between the Kingdom of Piedmont and Sardinia, basically soon to be Italy and France. It dealt with France getting Savoy.
Right, I remember that bit from history.
Now, attached to this treaty was a map. And this map is really the heart of the problem.
The map itself.
Well, what it showed.
Yeah.
The map drew the border in the Mont Blanc area, right along the watershed line. The ridge where water flows down either side.
Yeah, the natural divide.
So theoretically, that map split the summit of Mont Blanc right down the middle. Half in France, half in Piedmont, Sardinia.
Okay, seems clear enough on paper, or, well, on the map. But I'm guessing it wasn't that simple.
Not at all. France did ratify the treaty itself, the main document. But crucially, they never formally accepted that specific map.
Ah, so they signed the deal but disputed the picture that came with it.
Pretty much. The French position, which they based on something called the 1861 Delimitation Convention, meant to clarify things, was that the border should actually be further south.
Further south meaning?
Meaning the entire Mont Blanc massif, including the summit, would be in French territory. And their subsequent maps reflected this. Like in 1865, a Captain de Millet drew French maps showing this interpretation.
So right away, you've got two totally different official views of where the line is. What did the Italians do? Did they just accept the French version?
No, Italian map making, like the Sardinian Atlas of 1869, which built on earlier work, just kept showing the border along that original watershed line, splitting the summit.
Wow.
Figure 1 in that policy report shows it really clearly. You can see the two different lines in the contested spots, the Mont Blanc summit, the Dôme de Gouter peak, and the Col du Géant area near Point Hellbrunner. It's like two different realities mapped onto the same mountain.
It's wild that for, over 160 years now, two neighbors have fundamentally different maps for such a famous landmark. Did this cause immediate friction, like when they built the tunnel?
You'd think so, wouldn't you?
Yeah.
But the policy report points out something interesting. During the Mont Blanc tunnel construction, which was a huge joint project from 1957 to 1965, these map differences apparently didn't cause major issues on the ground.
Really?
It seems they managed to work around it practically. But the issue didn't vanish. It really started bubbling up again later, apparently after a conference in Nice in 1988 about the tunnel's upkeep. People started looking closely at the maps again.
So it simmered quietly for decades, then started to heat up. What really brought it to a boil more recently?
Things really escalated in the mid-2010s,
Yeah.
sort of between 2015 and 2020. We started seeing unilateral actions, things done by one side without agreement from the other, by local mayors and even national authorities.
What drove that? Do we know?
The report suggests it was largely driven by growing concerns about the environment up there, the fragile Alpine ecosystem, and also about the safety of all the tourists visiting the area.
Can you give some examples? What kind of actions are we talking about?
Oh, definitely. In 2015, French authorities actually bulldozed a border marker, moved it about 150 meters into what Italy considers its territory.
Wow, that's direct. Correct.
Yeah. Then the mayor of Chamonix blocked access to the Col du Géant from the Italian side, saying it was for safety reasons.
Okay, restricting access.
Then in 2019, the mayors of Chamonix and nearby Saint-Gervais banned paragliders from landing in a specific area Italy claims. And in 2020, French local authorities created this large protected zone, saying certain activities were off limits.
That's a protected zone.
But this zone, about 3,000 hectares, included a big chunk of land that, according to Italy's maps, is Italian territory.
So, actions with real on-the-ground consequences based on conflicting maps. You mentioned horizontal and vertical conflict levels. What's that about?
Yeah, the policy report uses that framework. Horizontal is the state-to-state stuff, France versus Italy. It's about their different readings of the 1860 treaty and this tendency for each side to just manage things based on their map unilaterally.
Like the national governments arguing?
Right. Then vertical is the conflict between local authorities, the mayors, the councils, and their own national governments. The locals are often pushing harder for environmental rules or tourist safety in their areas. You see it? They want, as the report puts it, administrative certainty, basically, knowing who's in charge of what right now.
So the mayors on the ground might be forcing the issue upwards.
Sometimes, yes. It's like the national teams are in dispute, but the local managers on the mountain face the day-to-day reality and sometimes take matters into their own hands, which then feeds back into the national dispute.
Yeah.
It's complex.
Okay, so we have history, we have recent actions. But the report title mentioned climate change. How does that play into this already messy situation?
This is where it gets really critical for the future, maybe not just here, but for borders everywhere. The report talks about mobile borders.
Mobile borders?
Yeah, it's a concept from border studies. It means borders defined by natural features like glaciers or maybe riverbeds aren't static. As the environment changes, glaciers melt, rivers shift, of course. The physical line of the border can actually move.
And Mont Blanc has glaciers, obviously. Big ones.
Huge ones, and they're melting fast. Figure 2 in the report shows this starkly. It plots the cumulative ice loss for key glaciers nearby Argentière, Routor, Jetro. The loss is significant and accelerating.
So if the border was drawn along, say, the icy crest of a ridge, and that ice melts, the crest itself might change shape or lower or shift slightly. The physical line moves.
Precisely. Glacier melt can physically alter the location of watersheds and crest lines. This adds this whole dynamic physical dimension to the Mont Blanc dispute. The ground itself is literally changing under this disagreement.
Is there technology to even track such subtle changes?
Yes, and that's another key point. The report mentions the ETRS 89 Framework European Terrestrial Reference System, 1989. Think of it as a super accurate GPS for all of Europe.
Okay.
Combined with modern GPS mapping, it allows for incredibly precise location tracking, down to centimeters. Precise enough to actually measure these border shifts caused by melting ice. Figure 3 shows the network of tracking stations, and Figure 4 shows a specific station near Mont Blanc in Lignan, Italy.
So we can measure the border moving if it is moving.
We have the tech, yes. But here's the rub.
There's always a catch.
Because of the ongoing dispute, the Mont Blanc area itself has been specifically excluded from the joint Franco-Italian efforts to validate coordinates using this precise system.
So the one place you arguably need it most, they aren't using it collaboratively.
Exactly. They agree on coordinates for most of their border, but not here. This lack of agreed-upon precise measurement just adds another layer of uncertainty onto the already existing disagreement about the historical line.
Wow. Okay, so it feels like a bit of an impasse. Are there examples elsewhere? Have other countries figured out ways to handle these kinds of mobile border situations?
Yes, and the report highlights some really interesting ideas. One is the concept of border singularities.
Singularity sounds sci-fi.
Maybe a bit. But it basically means unique border situations where instead of fighting over the exact line, countries focus on tailored agreements for managing shared resources or access across the area.
Like agreeing how to share something without drawing a perfect line through it.
Exactly. Think of Lake Constance between Germany, Switzerland, and Austria. There isn't a single agreed-upon line dividing the main part of the lake. They manage it cooperatively. Or the Ems-Dollard estuary between Germany and the Netherlands. They cooperate on shipping and environment, even though they disagree on the exact maritime border.
So practicality over pinpoint lines.
Sometimes, yes. The idea is that forcing a rigid line in a dynamic or complex area can create more problems. cooperation becomes the priority.
Does this apply in the mountains too?
Absolutely. And very relevant here are treaties. Italy signed with Austria in 1994, and especially with Switzerland in 2008. These specifically address mobile borders in the Alps.
Okay, what does the Italy-Switzerland one say?
It's quite innovative. It basically acknowledges that their mountain border can shift gradually due to natural things like erosion or glacier melt. They agreed to monitor these changes regularly using modern surveying.
And they update the maps.
They do biennial revisions. But, and this is important, sudden superficial changes, like a landslide maybe, don't automatically change the legal border. And if there are significant shifts, they have a mechanism to agree on swapping equivalent bits of land to sort of balance things out.
That sounds remarkably sensible.
It does. Figures 5 and 6 in the report show the Swiss-Italian border and a specific case study, the Refugio Guide del Cervino.
The Refugio Guide del Cervino. A mountain hut. What happened there?
It's a perfect real-world example. This mountain hut used to be mostly on Italian land, but because the glacier underneath it shifted, the watershed line, the border moved.
So the hut is now
Mostly on Swiss territory. And this wasn't just lines on a map, it created real headaches. Imagine needing permits from both Italian and Swiss authorities for renovations. Bureaucracy, delays, costs. It shows how a mobile border has very tangible impacts.
That really brings it home. It's not abstract. Has France shown any openness to this kind of flexible approach, acknowledging the shifting ground?
Well, the report notes one positive sign. A 2022 treaty between France and Andorra does explicitly use that high-accuracy ETRS-89 system for border demarcation. So France is willing to use the tech in some contexts.
But not yet with Italy on Mont Blanc regarding the mobile border aspect.
Not in the same comprehensive way as the Italy-Switzerland agreement, no. Not yet, anyway.
Okay, so given all this, the history, the recent tensions, the climate impact, the examples elsewhere, what are the potential ways forward for France and Italy on Mont Blanc?
The report lays out a few possibilities. One is to really embrace that agreeing to disagree approach seen in other border singularities. Use that as a starting point for joint projects.
Like what kind of project?
A big one could be a joint scientific border movement monitoring plan. Using those precise technologies we talked about, they already have the Observatoire du Mont Blanc collecting climate data.
So combine climate data with border tracking.
Yes. Integrate the climate data with border position data, validated using ETRS-89. And crucially, validate both conflicting border interpretations, see where each line actually falls according to the best tech.
Get the facts straight, even if they show two different lines based on the different historical claims. How would they set that up?
The report suggests a step-by-step process. First, pool the expertise, get the French and Italian mapping agencies, the observatory, maybe even the Swiss experts involved.
Build a team.
Right. Then set up a research platform, decide how often to measure, maybe linked to the hydrological year for glaciers, and crucially, create clear ways to share and compare the results. Maybe use the observatory as a central hub. Figure 8 in the report actually shows this as a cycle.
That sounds like a solid plan to at least understand the physical changes. But you mentioned earlier there were weaknesses in current cross-border cooperation. What needs fixing for something like this joint monitoring to work?
Good point. The report identifies some hurdles. Sometimes, cooperation focuses too much on just having equal numbers of people from each side in meetings, rather than making sure the people with the actual power and knowledge are there.
Form over substance.
A bit, potentially. Also, France and Italy have different ways their local and national governments interact, which can sometimes make cross-border talks more formal than truly collaborative. And smaller partners can become too dependent on bigger ones, which isn't always healthy for information flow.
So what's the solution there?
The report suggests aiming for substantial symmetry. Focus on getting the right competencies and powers to the table, not just equal headcounts. And generally improving how information flows up, down, and across the border between all the different players.
Makes sense. Get the right people talking effectively.
Exactly. And also make better use of structures that already exist, like the Espace Mont Blanc Cooperation Area, or the Alcotra program. Figure 7 shows its priorities for Alpine cooperation. These could be platforms for joint strategies.
We'll leverage what's already there.
Yes. The Quirinal Treaty between France and Italy is also mentioned as a framework for boosting cooperation generally, although a recent review suggested more progress is needed specifically on this Mont Blanc cross-border issue.
One last thing on the science. Did the report say if we know exactly how much the border has shifted due to ice melt?
That's a key gap identified. There hasn't been a specific quantitative study directly linking glacier melt rates to actual border changes right there in the disputed Mont Blanc zone. The report really stresses the need for that research to properly inform any future management plan.
It really drives home how climate change isn't just environmental science, it's geopolitics now. It's redrawing maps, or at least making us question them. The report also mentioned national identity and landscape briefly. How does that fit in?
That's often the deeper unspoken layer in these disputes. Drawing on another source about national identity in Canada and Switzerland, the idea is that nations often tie their identity to iconic landscapes, like the Alps for the Swiss.
Naturalizing the nation, I think you called it.
Exactly. It creates a shared symbol, especially in diverse countries. So for Mont Blanc, it's likely not just about the land or the treaty. For both France and Italy, that mountain is probably deeply tied to national pride, history, and identity. It's their iconic peak.
So it's symbolic as much as physical territory.
Very likely a significant part of why it's persisted for so long.
Okay, so let's try and wrap this up. We started with what seemed like a slightly odd, old argument over a mountaintop, but it's actually this incredibly complex mix. You've got a 160-year-old disagreement based on different interpretations of a treaty and its map,
Rooted in history.
layered with very real modern-day tensions and unilateral actions.
Driven by local concerns, too.
And now dramatically accelerated and complicated by climate change, physically altering the very ground they're arguing over, these mobile borders.
Precisely. The melting glaciers are adding a whole new dynamic, forcing the issue. While agreeing on one single line seems really difficult right now.
Yeah.
Examples from other Alpine countries, especially Italy and Switzerland, show there are other ways, focusing on shared management, using technology to monitor the changes cooperatively, acknowledging the border is dynamic. That seems like a potential path forward.
So for you listening, hopefully you now have a much clearer picture of this pretty unique border situation. It's not just lines on old maps. It's about how climate change is tangibly reshaping our world, right down to international boundaries.
And you've seen some of the innovative ways countries are trying, or could try, to adapt to this moving toward cooperation and flexibility when the ground itself is shifting.
Which leaves us with a final thought to chew on. Given that climate change is impacting natural borders everywhere, coastlines, rivers, glaciers, could this Mont Blanc situation, as tricky as it is, actually be a vital test case?
A testing ground for how we manage borders in the 21st century.
Exactly. Could it help us develop more adaptable, cooperative ways to handle these shifts globally? And maybe make us think, what other permanent landmarks that define borders today might become points of dispute tomorrow as the environment continues to change?
That's a really potent question for the future, isn't it? What happens when the lines we thought were fixed start to move?